it would begin with some sort of internationally agreed administration of Gaza in the future, where Egypt and Jordan would send administrators and troops to run the area to begin with. It would begin with that sort of thing. This may be impossible, but I don't see any other way of going about it. Otherwise, there's going to be a couple more centuries.
And Israel will have to concede something. Israel will have to say we have to join up the West Bank and Gaza. There has to be the guy from the ambassador to Denmark, the Palestinian ambassador, talks about this contiguous area. There's got to be a Palestinian territory, which means Israel has got to give up stuff. Now, the last bloke who was willing to do that was shot. So, and Benjamin Netanyahu is not going to do that. So that's another factor in this. Israel has got to concede something somewhere, hasn't it?
Yes, well, in particular, it would have to concede that there's a sovereign state next to it, run by Palestinians. But understandably, Israel would want to know that that's not a terrorist state.
William Hague, is it possible to say to Israel, you have to conduct your military operation in a different way? Because what they say to us, and they come on this program very regularly, they say, we are doing what we can to limit civilian deaths, but Hamas are there, Hamas are in tunnels, Hamas are near civilian areas. And I said, well, will you not drop bombs on these safer areas you're designating, these humanitarian areas you're designating? And they say they will continue to drop bombs there. So they might say they're doing what they can, but equally that comes with a whole butcher's bill of civilian deaths. Is there anything Israel could do differently? And if you were Foreign Secretary, William, would you be advising them to do anything differently?
Well, I'd be advising them to very strongly that they need to work out what they want to happen in Gaza after all of this has happened, and to bear that in mind. And I'd be advising them that we've got to get more aid into Gaza, although, of course, that aid, then you have to be sure the aid isn't going to Hamas in some way. But on the point you were asking about of civilians being in the line of fire, there is a huge responsibility on Hamas here, because all the evidence is that they do fire rockets from next to hospitals or UN positions, that they do have, for instance, in the last day also, explosive drones on the roofs, positioned on the roofs of civilian houses, that they use civilians as human shields in multiple ways. And so Israel does have a point when they say, well, what are we meant to do about that? We are trying our utmost to minimize civilian casualties. But if they fire rockets from a particular location, we're going to try to respond to that.
And that's a well-made point, William. But what's the practical consequence of that? Because I think you can make a moral and intellectual argument. The fault is Hamas is there, but the child is still dead. And the question is, at what point does that list of casualties, and Hamas say it's 8,000. We might not be able to trust that, but Israel say they don't know how many civilians are dead. At some point, is that number not going to be too high to stomach? Shouldn't be too high to stomach.
Well, while it's a good question, there are so many things that are impossible to stomach in this, aren't there? The things that were done to Israeli civilians when Hamas stormed through the border on the 7th of October, the taking of old people and children as hostages, and so on. And then, on the other side, then civilians being killed, in effect, in the crossfire of the war that Hamas wanted to create. So it's all very difficult to stomach. But in terms of actually practically what you do different militarily, well, we should always tell the Israelis to absolutely minimize civilian casualties. But we don't get to sit down with Hamas and tell them to do that. No. And they are the ones who produce the situation and who put the civilians, who very often put the civilians in the firing line. So people have got to remember the responsibility lies on both sides for that. And in the end, Israel is entitled to do what it can to dismantle Hamas as an organization and to free more of the hostages. But it has to bear in mind, well, what is Gaza going to look like after all of this? Otherwise, it will just turn into the same thing in another few years. And it has to conduct its military operations with that in mind, that there's got to be some sustainable authority there in Gaza.
I want to come. I want to come back to that question with you in a second, William. The future of all of this, but Kezia, we'll talk about, and then we'll talk about the domestic politics of this, Kezia. But you're just as a person observer. What's your moral stance? Is your moral stance changing at all on this, Kezia, as you watch what's happened since October 7th?
I think the thing we can't lose sight of is that there are going to be extraordinary numbers of civilian casualties in Gaza, and there'll be Gazans because of the proximity with which they are all living together. And that remains, under any circumstance, absolutely horrendous. And whilst, I understand and I support Israel's right to defend itself and to continue with the action that it's taking, the sheer geography of it and the proximity of these communities living together means that the case around getting humanitarian aid in is far greater than it would be in any other circumstance. So I actually think it is in Israel's interest to listen to other countries around the world who are leaning so heavily on the demand for a greater humanitarian response and to get aid in, if Israel want that long-term support for what they're doing here to sustain itself. I mean, there's one aspect of this which is about the military action. The other aspect of it is there are millions of people right now without food and water, and we're supposed to think that that's acceptable in some way. So I think there is a way through this to be able to support Israel, but also demand that the current situation is completely unacceptable and it must change if Israel are to sustain the support that they have.
And that might mean a humanitarian pause, and it might mean them not always hitting the targets they think they have to target if there's lots of people there, I guess.
Yes, yeah, I think that's right. But the reality is that people are starving right now and have been for days. And I think that requires a response if support for Israel is going to sustain.
William, just to look ahead, we had the Palestinian ambassador to Denmark on, and he still talked about a two-state solution. You've written before about this issue. It feels we're so far away from it. We have a UN, which is almost an entirely pointless organisation when it comes to actually making decisions that influence the patterns of behaviour by world leaders, it strikes me. How would you go about, if someone said to you, William, you're now going to devote the rest of your life to trying to make this happen, how do you even start it? What's the first step in some form of getting back to where we were at the end of the 80s, early 90s, where it looked like it was at least a possibility, because it doesn't look like a possibility now? What needs to happen in the short term, medium term, to get to a point where some sort of peaceful solution is possible?
Well, I think, as I wrote a bit about this in the Times last week, that it needs a bigger role for the Arab states in the region. This region has always been dominated by outside powers. It was Britain that had the mandate after the First World War for the whole region. And then the United States has really been the dominant outside power for many decades, and did produce the peace between Israel and Egypt and the Oslo Accords that gave some hope of a two-state solution in the 1990s. But now there isn't really an outside power that can bring it all together. And it is going to require these new, very strong powers. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates are becoming very, very rich, powerful countries. And they are going to have to assert some leadership. They've been improving their relations with Israel, but they're also going to have to get stuck in on trying to sort out, on the Palestinian side, a strong enough and peaceful leadership that Israel has a partner for the future. So I know that's much easier to say than do. It would begin with some sort of internationally agreed administration of Gaza in the future, where Egypt and Jordan would send administrators and troops to run the area to begin with. It would begin with that sort of thing. This may be impossible, but I don't see any other way of going about it. Otherwise, there's going to be a couple more centuries.
And Israel will have to concede something. Israel will have to say, we have to join up the West Bank and Gaza. There has to be the guy from the ambassador to Denmark, the Palestinian ambassador, talks about this contiguous area. There's got to be a Palestinian territory, which means Israel has got to give up stuff. Now, the last bloke who was willing to do that was shot. So, and Benjamin Netanyahu is not going to do that. So that's another factor in this. Israel has got to concede something somewhere, hasn't it?
Yes, well, in particular, it would have to concede that there's a sovereign state next to it, run by Palestinians. But understandably, Israel would want to know that that's not a terrorist state, that that's not a Hamas state. So, but yeah, they would have to concede that. But you have to produce the circumstances in which they'd have the confidence to do that. So, as I say, that's very difficult. A more likely scenario is these sorts of wars go on for, I know it's a depressing thing to say, on and off for another century or two. But the way to break out of it is the leadership within the region itself. And that is a new situation. That was not the case for the whole of the 20th century. There weren't strong enough countries in the region to take the lead, and there are now. So there's a big responsibility on the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and others who've become extremely rich and powerful and successful in the Middle East.